teachers need to teach, technologists need to get technology into students' hands, students need to learn. So the amount of time that it takes to effectively manage and specifically communicate all of the different steps within this life cycle and process of these devices is a difficult thing to do.
Hello there, and welcome to today's episode of the Easy EdTech podcast. If we haven't met before, my name is Monica Burns. I'm a former New York City public school teacher, and I've been out of the classroom for a few years, leading professional development for educators and writing about all things EdTech on my blog, classtechtips.com. Now, you might be used to joining me on Tuesdays for new episodes of the podcast, but today I've got something special for you. It's another bonus episode on a Friday, and today's episode is in partnership with VIZOR, a returning guest to the podcast too. Before we jump into today's episode, a quick reminder. You can head to my website, classtechtips.com/podcast for all of the show notes and resources from today's episode. And if you've got a phone in your hand or you have this episode queued up on your web browser and a podcast player, you'll also see the show notes link there too. Today's episode is sponsored by VIZOR. We all know how frustrating it can be when a student forgets their Chromebook or it's uncharged or damaged. Even worse, the device is lost. Getting a student a replacement device uses valuable class time, and then there's the admin, updating a spreadsheet or sending an email to IT and liaising with parents. If this sounds all too familiar, you need to look at VIZOR. VIZOR is a software solution which includes workflows specifically designed for schools to reduce the workload and frustrations for instructional staff and IT of managing devices. VIZOR even automates many workflows such as disabling lost devices. So no more spreadsheets, emails, or Google admin updates. To find out more and qualify for up to 20% off, visit vizor.cloud/Monica. That's VIZOR.cloud/Monica, or click the link in the show notes. Today's episode is titled Improving Communication on Device Management in Schools, a bonus episode with VIZOR, and I chat with Jeff Lalonde to discuss the communication challenges schools face managing devices and how communication can be made more effective. If you work in a school with lots of devices, it is no secret that schools and districts face lots of challenges in communication between instructional staff like classroom teachers, IT staff, and students and families when it comes to managing school devices, including Chromebooks. My conversation with Jeff gives plenty of insights and information on tackling this issue of communication. Let's dive into the convo with Jeff. Welcome to the podcast, Jeff. I'm super excited to talk to you today about communication challenges, especially the ones that schools face managing devices. But in addition to that piece, right, how communication can be made more effective. But before we dive into all of that, can you introduce yourself to listeners? Maybe tell them a bit about your role in education. What does your day-to-day look like?
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. And yeah, thanks, Monica. It's a pleasure to speak with you again. And I'm excited about this topic as well. It's a cool one and one that I hear about a lot. So yeah, before getting into that, my name's Jeff Lalonde. I work with VIZOR. I'm a solutions specialist here with VIZOR. And my day-to-day essentially involves primarily speaking with districts and schools about the challenges that they face with essentially managing their technology within the district. So most often I'm speaking with technical directors and their teams, but very often kind of outside of maybe just every day, speaking with teachers and instructional staff, librarians, teachers, media specialists, that typically folks that we meet maybe at conferences or maybe hear about us on podcasts like yours, ultimately introducing VIZOR to the technical team. So yeah, I generally spend my time speaking with those tech teams about what's going on, but part of that front line is certainly the educational staff that often, again, kind of refers to the technical team because they are on that front line and dealing with a lot of the challenges in managing devices.
Well, all of those reasons, right? Your conversations with so many different members of school and district communities is one of the reasons why, I am I'm glad we're having this conversation, that you're sharing your perspective, right? Because you're hearing from so many people. And, to start today's conversation, can you provide some examples of where communication is often overlooked, right? Between students and teachers and IT staff?
Yeah, well, you certainly hit that triangle really well. Kind of the students and their families, the instructional staff and technology. That triangle of communication certainly is important. And I think that just generally communication can be overlooked. So lots of times there's different ideas that need to be communicated. And generally speaking, communication is a very important component in any process, right? And so the process of managing technology is no different. So communicating, when they're brought into the environment and communicating, where they go throughout their life cycle. So beginning at purchase and right through the entire life cycle of the devices, there's a lot of communication involved, and just generally communication can be overlooked. And especially in terms of its importance, it really does play a very significant role in an effective and an efficient management process as it relates to the management of the devices themselves. So communication just generally being overlooked can have a lot of, I think, repercussions, but it goes right again from the point at which the devices are purchased through to the point at which they arrive at the district and then maybe are sent out to a specific school. They get into a specific classroom or to a specific teacher or library or just tech department or tech kiosk within a school. And then they get to the students and, the students use them, they break them. They return them, they lose them, they damage them, whatever the case is, they get to their end of their life. And throughout that process, it's really important to maintain a level of communication amongst that triangle that we talked about off the top, just to make sure that there's an effective process in place and that process is being communicated, which has its own sort of set of things. But I think the idea of communication itself is overlooked just generally as kind of an overview. And that's something I hear about regularly. And I think it's something coming up a lot more as districts become a lot more mature in their understanding of how to deal with this now, widely adopted one-to-one or widely adopted use of Chromebook devices within districts and sort of this remote learning type technology and the technology that's involved here. That sort of level of understanding is maturing. And I think that they're starting to see that. And the districts that I speak with regularly are really identifying this communication as something that's really, really important for them.
Yeah. And, I would imagine a lot of your conversations as well. And I know I see this when I'm talking to people in all of these roles, right? When Chromebooks were purchased as part of a distance learning initiative, things often happened fast, right? There wasn't a lot of planning. There wasn't a lot of, that luxury of time to say, like, what are our priorities here? What's our plan? What are we going to do? No, those if-then conversations that we would often have when you're able to really plan for a robust initiative just aren't happening, right? In the same way as if you are running into something. And, I would imagine that there's a lot of communication issues that you hear about and, in your experience and from what you've seen in schools, why do some of these communication issues occur?
Yeah, well, for a big part of it is what you just mentioned, Monica, just in terms of having the time to sit down and define these processes and policies right up front when sort of all of this kind of wide and mass adoption of this one-to-one or just the adoption of technology, allowing students to learn better and more effectively, I think, using technology, having the opportunity to sit down and define that. And then when not having that opportunity kind of resulted in sort of as districts are moving forward, kind of not ad hoc, well, maybe ad hoc, kind of defining these processes, right? And trying to put them in place and, defining an effective way to support these processes, I think was a challenge. And so I think it boils down to ultimately what the big deal is, why they occur is time, right? So teachers need to teach, technologists need to get technology into students' hands, students need to learn. So the amount of time that it takes to effectively manage and specifically communicate all of the different steps within this life cycle and process of these devices is a difficult thing to do. The challenge, I think, comes from the amount of time that it takes in order to properly and effectively manage that communication. So how do you sort of communicate with students that, they've now received a device and then communicate that reception of that device to the technology team so that they can apply the appropriate, protections that are defined in their OU policies, right? So every grade level, whether it's elementary, middle, or high school, each of these students have a very different sort of set of processes and protocols and protections in place related to their OU and that have to be applied to these devices. So how do you communicate that, when a student gets the device, communicate that from either the instructional staff who's given them the device, communicating it with the student? What are you going to, what's the proper care policy and the use of it? Notifying the family that their student has received a new device. So notifying the technology team that device is there. There's all sorts of different sort of challenges there, and the time that it takes in order to be able to, effectively communicate those different steps within the life cycle and the process is a really big challenge. It's a lot of time that it takes if there's not something effective in place. And so that's kind of where I think districts, a lot of the ones that we're dealing with on a regular basis, are using things like, Post-it notes or most commonly and most often like spreadsheets, right? And spreadsheets by way of communication or as a means of communication is very, very difficult to sort of do. It takes time to fill up the spreadsheet. You've got to set that aside, and then using it to communicate with somebody else. It's kind of a stagnant piece of technology that's not really living and there's no automation there. So it's tough. There's a lot of challenges. And I think it really boils down to, having the time that it takes to effectively manage those communications between students and faculty and staff. And then of course, the technology.
Yeah. And, as you were talking, Jeff, and saying sticky notes on devices, I had this like immediate flashback to being in the classroom and putting that sticky note like on the iPad that wasn't working, right? Or like,
right.
Don't pull this one from the cart, or like, this is the one that the camera does, like all the things that we would put on there, right? For our own little keeping track of that is not a real system, right? It's not really going to be something that helps foster communication. And I really like that you use the word mature, right, to describe some of these conversations that you're now having, right, at schools and districts, because I do think, we're in a space now, right, in education where we can anticipate some of the issues that might happen with a device, or we've seen a lot of things, right, over the past few years. If you've been part of a one-to-one initiative, and you can now say, like, these are the kind of issues we might have. This is what we need to be prepared for. But then that, communication issue comes into play that can act as a barrier. And you shared a lot already on why some of these communication issues occur. But let's flip that a bit. What can districts do to overcome challenges in communication regarding device management?
Yeah, well, I think first is kind of a policy, right? A process. So have something in place. So we talked about that in the maturity level now, right? There's an idea of what these problems are, and once you kind of identify them, what can you do? So defining a policy and a process that you're going to use to effectively communicate that that policy. That's a big one, is just having that in place. So identify what those gaps are. Where's the communication necessary? Where are we falling down in communication? And how do we fill that gap? And I mean, the first thing, like I said, process and having that defined, and then applying things like, tools, I guess, and solutions, but that can effectively manage that process for you. But the definition of that process is first. An example of that would be proper use policy that we just talked about with students. So having that proper use policy is one thing, but then providing a platform that, for example, you can communicate that to students. And there's districts that, they do things like it's obviously a very simple policy. The simpler, the better, the easier to digest for the students and their families, the better. But having that policy kind of front and center. So using platforms that they're already there. So email, socials, like social media platforms, and even on the devices themselves. So communicating what that policy is right on the home screen of the device, so that they're seeing that, they know exactly what that process is. Defining a way that you're going to communicate, let's say, returns or damaged devices. How are you going to communicate that to the technical staff, right? So if the students are reporting a device is lost or stolen or damaged to an instructional staff member, well, that has to be then, well, first of all, how do you do that? So that's number one, define how you're going to allow students and family to be able to submit this information or communicate this type of events, a lost or stolen or damaged Chromebook, to an instructional staff member. And then how is the instructional staff going to communicate that to the technical staff, who then has to affect change and actually communicate that to the Google Admin Console, right? So there's another level of communication. So what is that process going to look like? How do you communicate that with each of the stakeholders, the people for whom this is really important? I spoke to a district recently who was talking about having teachers at the beginning of the year brought into essentially an assembly where they're explaining what the process is going to be when a student needs a loaner device because they left it at their, a relative's house over the weekend, or they've lost that device or they didn't charge it. So what's that process going to be? So at this sort of general assembly at the beginning of the year, explain to teachers what the process is. So that's one way to overcome. It may not be the most effective, but it's an example of how, this communication, this communication is really, really important. The other one that you mentioned, something with the post-it and damaged devices, it reminded me of a pretty big district. I won't mention the name of the district, but a pretty big district. And they were saying that, they have a set of loaner devices that are available, and a school will let them know that they're running out of devices. And so they have to bring some more devices over there. And then they get there and there's this pile of Chromebooks sitting kind of in a corner. And what are those? Oh, those are the ones that are brought in the last week for repair. And it's this pile, and they have no idea that they were there, no idea what the story is. So there's no communication. So having that sort of, infrastructure for communication, defining what that communication has to be, where it needs to happen, and then how you're going to support that communication is really, really important. And it has to be simple, easy to follow, right? Obviously, as we talk about this kind of all the time, this is a daily theme. Students need to learn and teachers need to be teaching, right? You need to make their lives as simple as possible from a technology perspective so that they can do what they're there to be doing. For teachers, that's teaching. For students, that's learning.
And I think, I really like what you said about just keeping it simple, right? Structured, right? The if then, right? I know what to do in this situation, right? And if you have that really clear process, if you've defined that, maybe it's not on the first day of school, but maybe mid-year, you're realizing you need to, define that process of what it's going to look like, then you can automate it, right? Then you can refine it. Then you can make sure that you have systems in place that just keep things moving. So there isn't that pile where you're trying to remember what was wrong with each of these Chromebooks, right? Or the little thing, or trying to figure out, and you use the language of, the story of why this is in the pile, right? So if we are able to have a process and a structure for that, then we're able to break down some of those communication barriers of the what ifs for all of these pieces. So Jeff, I would love for you to tell us about VIZOR. How can it help schools and districts overcome these challenges in communication so that they can more effectively manage the devices that students use, that teachers use, right, over the course of the school year?
Sure. Naturally, Monica, probably my favorite part, just because dealing with these challenges, speaking about them every day with technologists and instructional staff, and then sort of being able to provide sort of a solution that I think effectively manages this process is really, it makes me very happy, because this is a significant challenge, right? And it's something that's really important. And so what VIZOR brings to the table is the ability to not only support those processes that we've just been discussing, but also, as you just mentioned, being able to automate those processes. So not just simplifying how is it that a teacher is going to communicate the fact that a student's just brought a device in for repair back to the technology department, and communicate with that same department that student's walking away now with a loaner device, that they need to apply the new OU and all the processes and protections and policies of that OU to that student, or to that student's device, so that they can get back to being a student right away. Not only that, but automating that process. So VIZOR does that automation. So it's not just defining a simple communication method, it's automating that method. So in that case that I just mentioned, VIZOR is going to be able to, with the scan of that device, so a student brings it back to the teacher, because of the automation side of VIZOR, you set it once and then you essentially apply all of these policies across all of the processes that we've just defined. And so a student brings in a device for repair, or they come to their teacher and say that I didn't charge my Chromebook, I need to borrow one. So the teacher can simply grab a Chromebook, scan it, hand it to the student, scan the device and then enter the student's name or scan the student's ID. And then the student walks away. All processes and policies are now automated. So what VIZOR can do is send a notification to that student with that proper use policy, and asking them to electronically acknowledge that they've read that policy and that they understand the consequences and they agree to it. And, yes, I've got this device. That same process can automatically send a notification to that student's family, so that they're aware of what the situation is, that there's now a loaner device in play, and the consequences for improper use or lost or stolen device. Also immediately and automatically communicate to the technology department. In fact, in this case, bypass the technology department and speak directly to the Google admin console and move the OU, that device that the students walked away with, to the OU of that student, so that all of those processes, protections and policies of that student's OU are immediately in place on that device so that they can immediately go to being a student. The teacher doesn't have to worry about writing anything down or tracking anything and communicating the fact that this device is now with this student, or remember to tell somebody when that student needs to bring that device back. It's all automated inside of VIZOR. So I tend to get a little excited about this just because it really has such a huge impact on teachers and on students. And that's, I speak to technologists every day and they're excited about it as well. But the frontline people, the people who are impacted by this positively in most part, in my opinion, are those teachers and the students, because they have all of this removed from their plate. There's no longer responsibility essentially for them to remember all of these things about managing technology. They just get to go back to doing what they're there to do, which is learn and to teach, which I think is pretty awesome. It's kind of my favorite part of what we do here.
Yeah. And just that ability to save people time, right? Make sure that you're using the precious minutes of your day wisely, right? And then of course, right, from all the different partners that are influencing what's happening, right, in a school or a classroom, right? That ability to know what's going on with different devices, what kind of trends are happening, what modifications might need to be made over the course of the school year, right? Anytime you're getting that level of data and transparency, right? It's massive. And if you're able to let people communicate, right, you're getting higher quality information too. I think, there's just so many reasons why I get excited about that, not just because I'm a systems, like things organized in a certain way kind of person, but because I'm very mindful of, right, how could we optimize this, right? Or how could we really use our time more effectively? And that's why I'm, so glad that you're here, not just to talk about the pain points, right? But how you can address those pain points, right, around communication. So how can schools find out more about VIZOR if they want to improve communication regarding device management?
Yeah. Sorry, just you mentioned one point, Monica, that I thought was really cool. And that was sort of speaking to the needs of the teachers and the instructional staff, students and their families. That's important too. But in terms of the ability to really effectively get a real handle on management of the devices, definitely technologists and administrators benefit from that side of the the automation side as well, right? So there's tons of money to be saved and tons of time on the instructional staff and student side, but on the technologists and on the administration side, you're not worried about Chromebooks falling through gaps. They're lost, or so you don't know what the story is with them. With automation and digital platforms managing the systems for you, you have a real handle on kind of what the story is, which ultimately results in less repairs because you're effectively communicating policy to students, and B, less lost or just sort of unknown kind of falling through the gaps type Chromebook. So there's a lot to be gained there on kind of all sides with an automated digital platform like VIZOR. So if your audience wants to learn more about VIZOR, certainly our website is an excellent resource for all sorts of information regarding VIZOR, as well as the ability to schedule a conversation or even a product presentation with one of our product specialists. And the website that your users can go to is www.vizor.cloud/Monica. /Monica actually brings with it a discount and an offering that we have right now, a promotional offering that we have right now. So yeah, VIZOR, that's VIZOR.cloud/Monica.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Jeff. We're going to link out so everyone can click on all the things and explore a bit more. But I really appreciate your time today and helping us tackle this big topic.
I appreciate the forum, Monica. Always a pleasure to speak with you. And I look forward to hearing from anybody that wants to learn more about what we've got going on.
It was a lot of fun having Jeff back on the podcast today to talk about a topic that I know is a pain point for so many in education. Let's finish up with this conversation with a few key points from today's episode. Establish a clear device care and repair policy. Have a plan for how to communicate with everyone. Automate your communication to prevent communication gaps. Remember, you can find the show notes and the full list of resources from today's episode at classtechtips.com/podcast. Again, a big thank you to our sponsor for this episode, VIZOR. VIZOR is a software solution which includes workflows and automations specifically designed for schools to reduce the workload and frustrations of managing school devices. To find out more about VIZOR and qualify for up to 20% off, visit vizor.cloud/Monica. That's VIZOR.cloud/Monica, or click the link in the show notes. If you're listening to today's episode on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, or maybe you've got another favorite app like Overcast, there's a whole bunch. Don't forget to hit the follow button. When you follow along with the podcast, each new episode downloads for you automatically so you don't miss a thing. And if there's something you love in one of the conversations, snap a screenshot of it, post it on social media, and tag me at Class Tech Tips. I might have something extra special to send to you. Thanks again for checking out this bonus episode on a Friday. Check back on Tuesday morning for another new episode of the Easy EdTech podcast.